3 generations of Murdoch's portraits hang in the courtrooms across the Low Country. They were one of the most powerful families in the area for over 100 years. We know what created the fall of the Murdochs, but what created the rise? Is Alex the first Murdoch to live outside the law while pretending to stand for justice? How far back does the corruption really go? We've all been asking these questions. Let's get to some answers. I'm Cassidy O'Connell, and this is the Murdaugh Mafia, Rise and Fall, Revised Episode 1, Randolph Sr., The Godfather. I, for one, am tired of hearing the word dynasty attached to the Murdochs. I think it gives the wrong idea about this family. It hypes them up more than they deserve, in my opinion. After all, they were not rulers in any sense of the word. They were not governors, senators, nor any kind of legislator. They were not even mayors. They were solicitors, which is a government lawyer. And they were dirty. From beginning to end. Dirty solicitors. I'm speaking specifically of the line from Randolph Sr. to Alex Murdaugh. But I'm leaving Alex's brothers, Randy and John Marvin, out of this. John Marvin avoided the legal field altogether, and I feel that if there was anything dirty in Randy IV's law practice, it surely would have come out in the investigation after Alex's arrest. They both seem to have good families and live quietly with them, so I don't want to bring any attention on them or include them in what I say here. But back to my point. I will not give them the title of dynasty. Most of us had never heard of the Murdochs and never would have if Alex had not stolen money from his clients and killed his wife and son. Their Wikipedia page exists only because of those things, and the many sins of Alex Murdaugh make up the majority of that page. I will not inflate an already inflated ego that was passed on from generation to generation. I will call them a much more fitting name, in my opinion. The Murdaugh Mafia. The first definition is, of course, what comes to our minds when we hear the word mafia, the international Italian mafia. But these other 2 definitions are so fitting to describe the Murdochs. Any organized group using extortion and other criminal methods. A closed group of people in a particular field having a controlling influence. I think that sounds just like the Murdochs. So rather than a dynasty which brings in more than a controlling influence, but comes with ruling, royalty, prestige, I see them more as a dirty, underhanded mafia. Their wealth was stolen, and their power was forced upon people. Their methods, as it turns out, often criminal. With the publication of many recent books and my own further research, I halted my story on the family that I began last year, and I'm revising episode 1 about the man who started it all, Randolph Sr. We've all heard the saying, power corrupts, and another one, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Give a man a little power, a little prestige, a little authority, and wow, you can bring out the worst in them. Historically, when you take that kind of authority, power, and prestige, and it flows through generations, you've got some real trouble with their view of the world and their place in it. For this series, I went into the Murdoch family history. The farthest back I could find was John Murdoch II, whose birth is estimated to be 1700. He married Miriam Jordan, that was born in or around 1706, and they had a son named Josiah Murdoch in 1737. Josiah was quickly born after the marriage, and he grew up to marry Cynthia Brown, who was born in 1750. They had a son, Lazarus, that was born in 1774. As it was before 1776, his birth took place in what was then the colony of Virginia. He grew up and married Mary Wilson and had a son, Josiah Putnam Murdoch, born on December 25th, 1793, and this is where more information on the family becomes available. The oldest picture of any Murdoch I've so far been able to find was of Josiah, whom I think Alex actually bears an astonishing resemblance to. There aren't a lot of pictures of the women till more recent times, so unfortunately, I mostly have gravesite pictures until the more modern generations. Josiah was born in Islandton. Interestingly, just a few miles from where Moselle is located today, and where his great times 3 grandson Alex would kill his great times 4 grandson Paul, 228 years later. Josiah's wife, Mary Varn, had 2 relatives, James G. Varn and his brother, Barry Varn, who owned a sawmill with lots of land in what was then called Dixie, a very small village. Josiah and Mary had Josiah Putnam Murdaugh Jr. on September the 10th, 1830. Since this is only focused on direct ancestors of Alex, I won't get into other children or other wives that aren't directly connected. As we know, this was the time period known as the American Railroad Construction Era. It began with the founding of the first passenger and freight line, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, in 1827. After that, there was a long construction with continuous railway building projects for the next 45 years until the financial panic of 1873, followed by a major economic depression. But just in the nick of time, the year before, in 1872, the Varn brothers sold the right-of-way to the Port Royal and Augusta Railroad for train tracks to cut through their land, after which the town became known as Varnville, with its post office opening that same year. The sale made a fortune for the Varn family. The Murdochs would continue to build their fortune on railroads. Josiah Jr., who went by Joe, was born on September the 10th, 1830, in Colleton. Before the Civil War, Joe was a postmaster. During the Civil War, he became a Confederate artillery soldier in 1861, serving as a private in the Hampton Legion. He served under Wade Hampton, who later became a governor and who the local school is named after. This school is mentioned in quite a few of the documentaries, so you may have heard this name before. Joe married Annie Marvin Davis. She was 17 years his junior a short time later. Annie Marvin Davis claimed to be related to the first, last, and only president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, who owned a cotton plantation with over 110 enslaved people and has been loosely linked to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Sometimes you'll find it reads that she's his first cousin, and other times she's described as a distant cousin. At any rate, Annie came from a wealthy family. Her obituary says that her birthplace was the beautiful estate Dorchester, so often mentioned by William Gilmore Simms, the South Carolina writer. After the Civil War, Joe left Colleton for Charleston and became a member of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is why he's described as a moneylender, and he became a wealthy low-country businessman. Joe compounded his wealth with phosphate mining and commercial fertilizer industries. With his ever-growing wealth, he expanded to real estate, amassing land in Beaufort, Hampton, and Almeda. I think Alex planned to follow in his footsteps by acquiring many plots of land, and we'll review Alex's ownership of many plots of land when we get to his story. But the Almeda tract of land is still in the Murdoch family. Joe and Annie Marvin had 7 children in total, with the second to the youngest being Randolph Murdoch Sr. Most places state that they had 5 children, with Randolph being the youngest. But in addition to these 5 better-known children, they had one son named Paul, born in 1879, location unknown. In this ancestral record, we see the list of all 7 children: Hattie, Herschel, Josiah, Paul, Mortimer, Randolph, and Mamie. Paul only shows up in one census as a 1-year-old while they were living in Beaufort, where they moved after Charleston. The youngest, Mamie, born in 1888, also location unknown, does not show up on any census events. The next census event recording was taken in 1900 and only includes Randolph at home as a 14-year-old boy, leading to the conclusion that Mamie at this point was no longer living. Joe and Annie were farmers and sharecroppers, but held education in very high regard. All of their children were educated by private tutors. Randolph Sr. was to become the first in the line of lawyers in the family, giving birth to the line of Murdochs we're focusing on in this series. In 1885, with failing eyesight, he retired back to Varnville, as we see him living in this census. Though they kept their family home in Varnville, he died in Charleston on August 17, 1912, at the age of 82, 2 years after their son Randolph set up his legal practice across from the Hampton County Courthouse. The family home burned down in 1915, and Annie died August 3, 1919, 1 day before her 72nd birthday, and shortly after the births of her grandchildren, Randolph Jr., known as Buster, and John Glenn, known as Johnny. Randolph I attended public school until high school, when he switched to the private school Morrison Academy in nearby Lawtonville. He chose the academy in an effort to attain his dream of enrolling at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. He was nominated by a local congressman at the age of 15 to attend the Naval Academy, but he was not accepted at that time. He graduated and enrolled at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, where he ran track and played football so well he was the team captain. At some point, while there, he was given the nickname Buster that would later be passed on to many Murdochs. When he was once again nominated to attend the Naval Academy, this time he was accepted. He was thrilled and immediately headed to Annapolis. He passed the entrance exam, but to everyone's surprise, in spite of all his sports play, he failed the medical exam due to what was described as an enlarged heart and a mitral murmur of great intensity. He did not want to accept the end of his dreams to be in the Navy and secured a new nomination. He was accepted again and returned to Annapolis 2 months later, but upon a second medical exam, his heart condition was confirmed, ending that dream. He went on to begin the course into law. He graduated from the University of South Carolina in 1908 and went on to attend its law school, where, although he was the president of the Student Law Association, he was described as a mediocre student. And when he graduated in 1910, he was deemed simply as proficient. After graduation, as mentioned, he set up his law practice in Hampton, specializing in civil litigation, and the brag was made that he was so well known he never needed to put up a sign because everyone knew who he was. He was a very busy man. He served as general counsel for Varnville and Hampton. He was the Chamber of Commerce director, the president of the county legal bar. He also began assisting the local solicitor with criminal trials. He soon met and married the 24-year-old daughter of prominent local physician Dr. Joseph Brantley Harvey, Etta Causey Harvey, on March 24, 1914, and she gave birth to their first son, Randolph Jr., later known as Buster, on January 9, 1915. Just reading about everything he had his hands in is exhausting, but in 1916, he added to all of that by founding a local paper, the Hampton County Herald. His wife Etta, beautiful and blonde, had been described as charming and accomplished, and one of the leaders of the society set of Hampton. Now, with his son and namesake, he had a lot to show off to the world, and what better way than than to own and control the newspaper to put out your own narrative to the world. The Herald was a place to report the events, gossip, his wife's garden parties, and promoting his own legal activities. On August 1918, Etta gave birth to their second son, John Glenn Murdoch, known as Johnny. Unfortunately, the only pictures I could find of Etta are of her marriage certificate, gravesite, and death certificate. She died less than 3 weeks after giving birth to John Glenn Johnny Murdoch. Her death certificate says she died from sepsis, most likely an infection from a childbirth complication. We know the route Buster took, but Johnny Murdoch joined the United States Army and served as a paratrooper. He was the highest decorated veteran of World War II from Hampton County, receiving a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and 2 Purple Hearts. After the war, he retired to become a farmer. Recent accounts have revealed that Johnny may have been a hero at war, but at home, he was the worst thing a human can be: a pedophile. Though I only intended on following the line leading down to Paul, I will include an episode on him because it's one of the darkest Murdoch secrets that was overlooked by all of the Murdoch solicitors while they sent people to the electric chair. Suffice it to say, the wrong life was lost on September 15th, 1918, when Etta died from giving birth to Johnny. In addition to everything we've already heard that Randolph I was involved in, he also served 2 two-year terms on the school board and was a 3-time delegate for Hampton County to the Democratic Party State Convention. 1919 was a big year for Randolph. He quietly married his second wife, Estelle Marvin, on November 30th, 1919. He began running for public office for the first time for local solicitor. The job of solicitor wasn't a high-paying job. In fact, the salary was quite small compared to the workload. For those of us not from South Carolina, we're probably not familiar with what a solicitor even does. Many states have what's called a solicitor general, but that's not the same thing. What other states refer to as a district attorney, something we've seen a lot on TV and movies, South Carolina refers to as circuit solicitors. So now, hearing the term DA, we understand a little more of what the glamour is to having that position. Speaking to the time Randolph I held that position especially, it came with some special perks. First of all, the solicitor, like a DA, decides which cases to prosecute, so they controlled the court docket. They handled all plea bargains as well. In those days, solicitors could still have clients in their private law firms, so this was a real perk. People would seek out a solicitor for their cases because of his position and reputation. The solicitor had the power to nominate others for the position of judge, sheriff, coroner, or other high-profile positions. Rumors abound of behind-the-scenes and under-the-table endorsements. With all of these powers, many people were inclined to win a solicitor's favor. So naturally, the solicitor was himself favored when he was actually bringing a case or defending a case before the court, which led to more wins than losses. Just think about the level of celebrity that innately seems to go with being in an elected position or one that's often written about in the newspaper. You also have the fear of displeasing someone in that position. So in so many ways, there was power, prestige, and wealth from holding this position. So this moment, shall we say, was where the Murdoch Mafia was born. The incumbent solicitor had just resigned to run for the Senate, so Randolph ran against opponent Heber Paget and was elected to become the solicitor in the 14th Judicial Circuit in 1920. He was supposed to begin his career as solicitor in February 1921, but fell ill and wasn't seen in court until 3 months later. When he did finally start his career, it was with guns blazing, cleaning out corruption from higher levels. Some say he wanted corruption gone, while others can't help but note that pursuing higher-level men to convict makes a higher-level name for yourself, such as when he prosecuted 2 county auditors, W.A. Mason and T. Haygood Gooding, who had already been prosecuted by the State Tax Commission in 1919, yet had been re-elected as Hampton County Auditor. Murdoch prosecuted both, leading to their removal from office. Though lauded by some for his takedown of many banks he deemed corrupt, his intentions may not have been as altruistic as believed. In May 1921, Randolph was appointed a local representative of the First Carolinas Joint Stock Land Bank, which was formed to loan money on farmland and city property. It was advertised in the newspaper as offering loans with little red tape, also adding that Mr. Murdoch himself would be ready to interview applicants at any time. This would be seen as a conflict of interest in our day to actually be taking down his competition. Could this be the reason he was clearing out so many banks? This topic will come up again. The next year, in 1922, he prosecuted Colleton County Sheriff W.B. Ackerman for embezzlement. Ackerman later killed himself while in the process of closing up office. As we see in this newspaper clipping, we see he had been indisposed for a day or two and was in bed Friday, but had seen a number of callers on business matters. He was said to have been despondent, but discussed some matters with Deputy Sheriff Beach connected with his closing up the business of his office, and then sometime later was found to have shot himself. He was replaced by Lucas C. Paget, who had previously served as Sheriff of Colleton, as seen in this article about the Spanish flu lockdown from 1918, as we see in this newspaper article that goes on to give the instructions of how to observe the lockdown for the epidemic, and it's very much like what we just went through 102 years later. Randolph prosecuted a lot of bankers during the financial collapses of the Great Depression, including 3 prominent Hampton County banks: Merchants and Planters Bank of Varnville, the Merchants and Planters Bank of Brunson, and the Bank of Hampton. He also prosecuted 2 Beaufort County bankers and 2 officers of the First National Bank and Trust in faraway Lancaster. This gives meaning to Judge Newman's words to Randolph's great-grandson Alex during his sentencing, as Alex had corruptly stolen from clients, friends, and misused bank funds, the exact crimes that Randolph I had so diligently prosecuted. In 1924, Randolph prosecuted Governor Wilson G. Harvey for accepting deposits while knowing his bank was failing and insolvent. The case played out in Allendale, outside of his home turf of Hampton, where he faced prominent lawyer Edgar A. Brown of Barnwell. But in spite of his courtroom dramatics, such as putting the governor in the prisoner dock while the indictment was read, he lost the case. The next year, however, Randolph evened the score when Harvey pleaded guilty to charges for lending excessive amounts of the Enterprise Bank's money to the Consolidated Truck and Auto Company of Charleston, a company he held sizable interests in. In exchange for Harvey's guilty plea, Randolph dropped 2 other charges of taking excessive loans from his bank for himself and his brother-in-law. Sounds like Harvey and his brother-in-law were the original version of Russell and Alex. Randolph became known for his courtroom antics, so much so that the gallery was filled with people who came just to watch, much the way we find ourselves glued to court TV today. It was especially exciting as he prosecuted preachers, police officers, bankers, and corrupt politicians. He no longer needed to run the newspaper to be regularly mentioned there. He and Estelle regularly made the society pages, whether it be attending garden parties or judging flower shows. He was one of the most talked about men in town. He was the first, but certainly not the last Murdaugh to use the courtroom as his own theater. It was also under his time as solicitor that the 14th Circuit court system first started its reputation of being a judicial hellhole. The word on the street, starting with Randolph I down through the rest of the Murdochs who served as solicitors, was that if you got on the wrong side, you'd soon be tailed by a policeman, fired from a job. In more recent times, end up with drugs suddenly appearing in your vehicle or workplace. The saying of the Murdoch Mafia era was play by the rules or die by the rules. Though neglected most of the time to the care of nannies, Randolph Sr. would bring Randolph Jr. to the courthouse, where he would watch him try cases. He was setting up not just himself, but his legacy. In 1925, Randolph brought murder charges against Alonzo Seabrook, a federal prohibition agent, and another officer, State Agent E.J. Harrington, who, while looking for contraband liquor on May 25th, noticed a boat under repair on the edge of the water. They raided it, and during the raid, J.G. Pittman, who was sleeping on the boat, heard the raid and, not knowing who was aggressively moving on the boat, shot in their direction. Federal Agent Seabrook, instead of identifying themselves, fired back, killing Pittman, who was 67 at the time. In the end, the boat was not a liquor smuggling boat, as they had mistakenly believed. In fact, they found less than a quart of whiskey on board. There was a serious divide between the public and law enforcement when Randolph charged the officers for the killing. In the end, the judge acquitted the officers, excluding a jury from the decision. I mentioned this earlier, something very sickening and very important to keep in mind for a future episode about both Randolph's brother Johnny and Randolph's own 17-year-old grandson, Randolph III. Yes, you heard that right, Alex's father. But we'll hear about Johnny and Randolph's assaults, as in more than once, on a very young step relative. We see some real hypocrisy in 1927 when Randolph I convicts a married minister for regularly sexually assaulting a 13-year-old girl and eventually impregnating her, and 4 years later prosecuting an 18-year-old for the rape of an 8-year-old who, when she was unable to testify, he allowed her mother to sit in the witness seat and hold her while she testified. The man was given 40 years in prison. These men deserved all they got and more, but I'm mentioning the hypocrisy because Randolph II stood by and watched relatives get away with the same things, as you will learn in future episodes. On November 13th, 1928, Randolph was listed on the board of directors for a newly opened People's Bank of Columbia. It was affiliated with numerous banks. Again, what a conflict of interest for a man who had taken down so much of the competition in this area. And again, makes you question his motive for taking down all these banks and bankers. Randolph Jr. married Gladys Marvin on June 24th, 1937, with Randolph Sr. serving as his best man. The very next month, Randolph married his third and final wife, Mary T. Hoffman. 1939 was a big year for Randolph Sr. It didn't start off well due to a hospitalization for uremic poisoning. Uremic poisoning can be caused by a few different things, but most often it's from kidney disease. Remember, he was diagnosed at a very young age with a very serious heart disease. When your heart has failed to pump blood efficiently through your body, the organs, usually the kidneys, begin to suffer from the poor blood supply and start to fail. To put it simply, Randolph was dying. Also in 1939, he welcomed Randolph II into his law practice, and on October 25th, 1939, Gladys gave birth to Randolph III, making him a grandfather. He was running unopposed for his 6th term as solicitor. But later that year, he fell ill again. In fact, he was so ill that it had been reported on a few times in the local paper. Throughout the year, his son Randolph Jr. had to fill in for him several times in court. He was hospitalized in April 1940, after which he spent several months convalescing at home. The symptoms of uremia can be painful, with things as small as weakness, fatigue, and muscle cramps, to a very painful inflammation of the lining of the heart called pericarditis. It can even cause seizures and comas. The man who had once been involved in a little bit of everything found himself homebound and in physical misery. On July 19th, 1940, after leaving a friend's home, which some say was to attend a poker game, he approached a railway crossing at around 1 a.m. The engineer of the train, W. Bartlett, described a very strange scenario indeed. First, he simply saw a light blinking off and on. He studied it to see if it was Morse code or frantic emergency flashing, but it was neither. The train was going at the speed of 35 miles an hour and began to draw close. Finally, from 200 yards away, he saw that the light was coming from a car sitting to the right of the tracks by an old mill. Bartlett looked on in horror as the driver suddenly drove up onto the tracks. At this point, he was only 30 yards away. The light now shone directly into the car. Bartlett could see Randolph very clearly, even that the color of his shirt was white. Oddly, Randolph raised his arm in a wave and smiled. Bartlett sounded the whistle over and over, causing the rest of the crew to come and see what was happening. They, too, saw Randolph's car parked on the tracks directly ahead of them. They, too, watched in horror as he smiled and waved. Of course, there's no way to stop a moving train in that short of time, so it quickly smashed into the car, hurling it 900 feet up the track, and Randolph was tossed out about 150 feet from the crossing where he lay dead. Only 9 hours after the crash, the engineer was on the witness stand in the Hampton County Courthouse at the formal inquest into Randolph's death. Bartlett told his recollection of events in detail. Next, the brakeman, J.H. Montgomery, concurred, adding, "This man drove up in the middle of the track and stopped and was looking up at the engine. He looked like he was waving to us, and we couldn't stop, and we ran right into him." Last to speak was the train fireman. This is the man on the train who tends to the coal furnace, C.T. Billiter, who added, "I believe that if anyone here in this courtroom had been there like that, they could have gotten out if they had wanted to." The tragedy was written up as an accident, but the local gossip speculated anything from him being drunk to it being intentional. If he was in fact coming from a poker game, he very well may have been drunk. However, the bizarre nature of it all does make you wonder. Had he lost something big in the poker game? Or just simply wanted to end it all because of his illness? Was he disoriented from being ill, drunk, or both? I noticed something interesting while looking at this. The date that he was hit by the train was the mother of his children and first wife Annie Marvin's birthday. What transpired on that day, her birthday? His sons were raised, one in the army, the other a lawyer ready to step into his father's shoes. Is that what was on his mind when he drove onto those tracks? Another question we'll never know the answer to. However, this was a huge piece of the rise of the Murdochs, since Randolph's son, Randolph Jr., or Buster Murdaugh, took no time to file a suit against the Charleston and Western Carolina Railway Company, which would later become CSX, for wrongful death on October 1st, 1940. It created huge wealth for the family and set them on their path to more power and influence. This was the first lawsuit against the railroad, but not the last. It became such a regular thing for that law firm that the building is nicknamed the house that CSX built. Buster asked for $100,000. Adjusting for inflation, this would be $2 million today, and the suit was settled on September 22nd, 1941 for an undisclosed amount. Where Randolph Sr. had the reputation of fighting corruption, his son often found himself in a heap of trouble. Find out more of his life in the next episode of Murdaugh Mafia, Rise and Fall, where we'll dive into the life of Randolph Murdoch Jr., a.k.a. Buster. This is Cassidy O'Connell saying stay well and stay tuned.